The Pennsylvania winter descended upon the Continental Army like a divine punishment in December of 1777, transforming the rolling hills west of Philadelphia into a wasteland of frozen mud and skeletal trees that offered no shelter from winds that cut through threadbare uniforms like sabers through flesh. General George Washington, commanding what remained of the principal American field army after a campaign season of unrelenting disasters, led his 11,000 men, though men dignified with military terminology what were in many cases scarecrows wrapped in rags into winter encampment at a place called Valley Forge, 20 miles from Philadelphia, where the British Army sat warm and well-fed in commandeered houses, while their Hessian auxiliaries drank the city's taverns dry. The site Washington selected possessed certain military advantages: defensible high ground, proximity to the Schuylkill River, close enough to Philadelphia to monitor British movements, but far enough to prevent surprise attack. Yet these tactical considerations would prove meaningless compared to the fundamental reality that would define the next 6 months. Valley Forge was a death trap, and the Continental Army was marching into it with neither adequate food, nor clothing, nor shelter, nor any realistic prospect of obtaining these necessities before spring. The army that stumbled into Valley Forge in mid-December bore little resemblance to the force that had defended Philadelphia just months earlier. The campaign of 1777 had been catastrophic for American arms. Washington had been outmaneuvered at Brandywine Creek in September, where British General Sir William Howe's flanking movement had caught the Americans unprepared and sent them fleeing toward Philadelphia. At Germantown in October, Washington had attempted a complex night attack that dissolved into chaos when American units fired on each other in the fog, transforming what might have been victory into another humiliating retreat. Philadelphia, the national capital and largest city in the rebellious colonies, had fallen to the British without serious resistance, forcing the Continental Congress to flee first to Lancaster and then to York, governing a revolution from exile while enemy officers attended theater performances in the city, where independence had been declared just 16 months earlier. The soldiers who marched to Valley Forge carried the physical and psychological scars of these defeats. Many were barefoot, their shoes having literally disintegrated during the autumn campaigns, leaving bloody footprints in the snow that marked the army's line of march, a detail recorded by multiple witnesses, and one that would become emblematic of Valley Forge's suffering in later American mythology. Others wore shoes so warm that they provided no protection from the cold, the leather cracked and separated, toes protruding through holes that no amount of improvised patching could seal. Uniforms, never uniform in the Continental Army, where each state clothed its own regiments according to different standards and availabilities, had degraded into a patchwork of military coats, civilian clothing, and blankets wrapped round shoulders. Some men wore captured British red coats turned inside out to hide the color, creating a grotesque parody of military dress. Hats were scarce, leaving men's heads exposed to rain and snow. Blankets, essential for survival in winter campaigning, were in desperately short supply. Many soldiers possessed no blanket at all and would sleep huddled with comrades for warmth. The encampment site itself, when the first units arrived, was simply open ground, no buildings, no prepared shelters, nothing but frozen earth and scattered woods. Washington's orders specified that the army would construct log huts for winter quarters, following a standardized design, 14 by 16 feet, accommodating 12 men, with a fireplace at one end and bunks along the walls. Officers would have slightly larger huts proportional to their rank. The plan was sensible in theory, but nightmarish in execution given the condition of the troops and the severity of the weather. The men would have to fell trees, drag logs to the campsite, notch and stack them to form walls, construct roofs from whatever materials could be scavenged, chink the gaps between logs with mud and clay to keep out the wind, build fireplaces and chimneys from stone, and complete all this labor while subsisting on starvation rations, wearing inadequate clothing, and working with tools that were themselves in short supply. Washington attempted to motivate this effort by offering a prize of $12 to whichever regiment completed its huts first, a gesture that revealed both his understanding of soldier psychology and the pathetic limits of his resources. $12 was a pittance, but it was all he could offer. The work proceeded with agonizing slowness. Men weakened by hunger and exposure could not maintain the pace of labor required. Axes broke or went dull, and there were insufficient files to sharpen them. The green wood, heavy with moisture, was difficult to work and would shrink as it dried, creating gaps in the walls. Many soldiers lacked even basic shelter for weeks while their huts were under construction, sleeping in canvas tents that provided minimal protection from December's freezing temperatures, or simply in the open, huddled around fires that provided warmth on one side while the other side froze. The supply situation, critical when the army arrived at Valley Forge, deteriorated from critical to catastrophic as December became January and January became February. The Continental Congress, that body of delegates who had declared independence with such bold rhetoric in 1776, proved itself catastrophically incompetent at the mundane tasks of military logistics. The Commissary Department, responsible for procuring and distributing food, had essentially collapsed. Thomas Mifflin, who had served as Quartermaster General, the officer responsible for transportation and supply, had resigned in frustration in October, and his replacement, William Buchanan, found himself overwhelmed by a task that would have challenged the most capable administrator. The fundamental problem was not merely incompetence, though there was plenty of that, but the structural inadequacies of the revolutionary government itself. The Continental Congress possessed no power to levy taxes directly. It could only request money from the individual states, which provided funds irregularly and in amounts far below what Congress requested. Without reliable revenue, Congress resorted to printing paper money, the Continental dollar, which depreciated rapidly as more was printed, creating a vicious cycle where Congress needed to print more money to purchase the same amount of goods, which caused further depreciation, which required printing yet more money. By the winter of 1777 to 78, continental currency was approaching worthlessness, and farmers and merchants who had initially accepted it in payment for goods delivered to the army now refused it, demanding hard currency, gold or silver, that Congress did not possess. The phrase "not worth a continental" entered American vocabulary during this period, capturing the collapse of the revolutionary currency in popular speech. Even when food could be purchased, transporting it to Valley Forge proved nearly impossible. The Quartermaster Department lacked sufficient wagons and horses. The roads, primitive even in good weather, became impassable in winter. Local farmers, those who had not fled the area when the armies approached, hoarded their produce rather than sell it for a worthless paper money or have it confiscated by foraging parties. The British in Philadelphia, able to pay in sterling and supplied by the Royal Navy, which controlled the Delaware River, outbid American purchasing agents for available food stocks. Washington found himself in the absurd position of commanding an army starving in the midst of relatively productive agricultural country because the mechanisms to transfer food from farms to soldiers had broken down completely. The daily ration, when there was any ration at all, fell to levels incompatible with survival. A soldier performing hard physical labor and constructing log huts in winter counted as hard labor requires perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day to maintain body weight and health. The Continental Army ration at Valley Forge, in the rare periods when full rations were issued, provided perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 calories. More commonly, the ration was half that, and there were periods, multiple periods, sometimes lasting days when no ration was issued at all because there was literally no food in camp. Soldiers existed on fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked on hot stones that provided calories but little nutrition. When flour ran out, they boiled whatever they could find: bark from trees, roots dug from frozen ground, leather from their shoes or equipment boiled until it became barely chewable. The cry "no meat, no meat" became a sardonic chant in the camp, soldiers' bitter commentary on their starvation. Malnutrition created a population vulnerable to disease, and disease duly arrived. Typhus, spread by lice that infested the crowded huts where proper hygiene was impossible, cut through the camp. Typhoid fever, transmitted through contaminated water and food, inevitable when thousands of men were crowded together without adequate sanitation, struck down soldiers by the hundreds. Dysentery, the bloody flux that had killed more soldiers than enemy action throughout military history, ravaged men whose bodies were already weakened by starvation. Pneumonia claimed those whose immune systems, compromised by malnutrition, could not fight off respiratory infections acquired from sleeping in unheated shelters or in clothing that remained damp for weeks. Smallpox, that historic scourge that had devastated armies since ancient times, found fertile ground among soldiers who had not been inoculated, inoculation being a controversial procedure that many Americans distrusted despite its demonstrated effectiveness. The death toll mounted with arithmetic inevitability. The precise numbers remained debated by historians because record-keeping at Valley Forge was sporadic and incomplete, but the consensus is that approximately 2,000 to 2,500 soldiers died at Valley Forge between December 1777 and June 1778, roughly 20% of the army that entered camp. These men did not die gloriously in battle, did not fall before enemy fire while defending liberty, did not make dramatic last stands that would be commemorated in paintings and poetry. They died miserably in fetid huts, consumed by fever, weakened by starvation until their bodies simply ceased functioning, buried in mass graves or shallow pits in frozen ground too hard to dig properly, often without coffins or shrouds, their deaths recorded, if at all, in tercenturies in regimental books. Dire disease. Desertion, that perpetual challenge for any army, but especially severe in a revolutionary force whose soldiers were citizens rather than professionals, became epidemic. Men slipped away nightly, walking out of camp and disappearing into the Pennsylvania countryside. Some went home, deciding that survival and family obligations outweighed revolutionary commitment. Others joined the British, accepting the offer of pardon that General Howe extended to rebels who would take an oath of loyalty to the crown. Washington lacked the resources to pursue deserters effectively, and even when they were caught, punishment was problematic. Executing deserters would further reduce his already depleted army. But failing to punish them encouraged more desertions. He resorted to public floggings and humiliating punishments like riding the wooden horse, a torture where the victim sat astride a sharp rail for hours. But these measures proved insufficient deterrent to men who calculated that any fate was preferable to starving to death at Valley Forge. The officers, though they suffered less than the enlisted men, they had better quarters, access to slightly more food, and funds to purchase supplies from local farmers. Faced their own crisis of morale and purpose. Many had sacrificed lucrative civilian careers or comfortable family situations to accept military commissions, motivated by ideological commitment to independence or by the social prestige that officer rank conferred. Now, they watched their commands disintegrate from disease and desertion, saw their men dying from preventable causes, and received neither pay nor recognition from a Congress that seemed indifferent to their suffering. The Conway Cabal, a loosely organized movement among certain officers and congressional delegates to replace Washington with General Horatio Gates, who had won the victory at Saratoga in October 1777. Intraction during the Valley Forge winter, fueled by frustration with Washington's leadership and the disasters of the Philadelphia campaign. Though the cabal was more a collection of grumblings and correspondence than an organized conspiracy, it revealed the extent to which confidence in Washington had eroded. Washington himself, bearing the weight of command during the worst crisis of the war to date, demonstrated both the strengths and limitations that would define his historical reputation. He was not a military genius. His tactical decisions during the 1777 campaign had been frequently flawed, and his strategic conception was conventional to the point of rigidity. But he possessed qualities that proved more valuable than tactical brilliance in the circumstances of Valley Forge: an unshakable sense of duty, physical and moral courage, the ability to endure hardship without complaint, and a talent for political maneuver that allowed him to maintain support in Congress despite the complaints of his critics. He shared his soldiers' deprivation to the extent his position allowed, refusing to establish comfortable headquarters while his men froze in huts. He wrote countless letters to Congress, to state governors, to anyone who might provide assistance, describing the Army's suffering in language calibrated to motivate without offending, requesting without demanding, explaining the consequences of an action without threatening. These letters, preserved in Washington's papers, reveal a commander walking a tightrope between military necessity and political reality, aware that he commanded not merely an army but a symbol of the revolution whose collapse would likely mean the end of American independence. The strategic situation during the Valley Forge winter magnified the psychological pressure on Washington and his army. The British in Philadelphia enjoyed every comfort: warm quarters, plentiful food, entertainments, the company of loyalist civilians who welcomed their presence. General Howe, criticized by London for his failure to destroy Washington's army despite multiple opportunities, nevertheless had achieved the capture of Philadelphia and the dispersal of Congress, accomplishments that looked impressive in reports to the ministry even if they had not actually ended the rebellion. The British could have marched from Philadelphia to Valley Forge at almost any point during the winter and destroyed the Continental Army with minimal effort. The Americans lacked the strength to mount effective resistance, and even a modest British force could have overrun the camp. That Howe chose not to attack reflected his strategic assessment that the Continental Army would likely dissolve on its own without British action, making an assault unnecessary and potentially costly. Yet the British inaction, while sparing the Americans from military assault, created its own torment. The soldiers at Valley Forge knew that warm quarters and plentiful food existed just 20 miles away, enjoyed by the enemy while they starved. The psychological impact of this proximity was devastating. They were not suffering because no supplies existed anywhere, but because the system had failed to deliver available supplies to them. The knowledge that British soldiers mocked them, that loyalist newspapers in Philadelphia published descriptions of the Continental Army's disintegration, that European observers predicted the imminent collapse of the rebellion. All this added humiliation to physical suffering. Into this nightmare stumbled Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben in February 1778. A Prussian military officer who claimed to have served on Frederick the Great's staff and who arrived at Valley Forge with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin in Paris. Steuben's credentials were partly fabricated. He had been a captain in the Prussian army, not a general staff officer, and his baron title was self-awarded, but his military expertise was genuine. And he possessed exactly the skills the Continental Army desperately needed. He understood European drill and tactics, the system of movement and maneuver that allowed armies to function as coordinated entities rather than armed mobs. He recognized immediately that the Continental Army, for all the courage individual soldiers had displayed, lacked the basic infantry skills that European armies took for granted. Steuben spoke no English, communicating through interpreters and through the universal language of drill and demonstration. He began with a model company of 100 men, personally training them in marching, wheeling, loading and firing muskets, bayonet drill, and the countless small procedures that distinguished trained infantry from militia. The work was grueling, made more difficult by the soldiers' physical weakness and the language barrier, but Steuben possessed both patience and the ability to demonstrate rather than merely instruct. He drilled alongside the soldiers, showing them personally how to execute each movement, correcting errors with gestures when words failed, employing a mixture of encouragement and profanity that transcended languages frustrated. Exclamations in German became legendary in camp, and his interpreter would often simply translate them as "he says you are doing it wrong." The model company, once trained, became instructors for other companies, spreading Steuben's system throughout the army. By March, the daily drill had become routine, and something remarkable began to happen. The Continental Army started to function as an army rather than a collection of regional militias. Units could maneuver in coordination. Companies could form from column into line and back again without dissolving into chaos. Soldiers loaded and fired their muskets in coordinated volleys rather than individual, uncoordinated shooting. Bayonet drill transformed the bayonet from a cooking implement, which is how many soldiers had used it, lacking proper training, into an actual weapon. The improvement was not instantaneous or complete, but by spring the army that would march out of Valley Forge bore little resemblance to the disorganized force that had stumbled into winter quarters. Yet Steuben's training could not have succeeded without improvement in the basic conditions of survival. That improvement, when it finally came, resulted not from congressional action or divine intervention, but from the initiative of a new quartermaster general, Nathanael Greene, who accepted the position in March 1778 with great reluctance, recognizing it as a career-destroying assignment that would generate complaints from everyone and gratitude from no one. Greene, one of Washington's most capable subordinates, and a general who aspired to battlefield command rather than administrative duties, nevertheless threw himself into the logistics challenge with the same energy he brought to combat. Operations. He reorganized the supply system, established regular routes and schedules for wagon transport, negotiated contracts with local farmers, and most importantly, began paying for supplies in certificates that, while not hard currency, at least represented a promise of eventual payment that farmers found more acceptable than worthless continental dollars. The supply situation improved incrementally rather than dramatically. There was no single moment when starvation ended and plenty began, but rather a gradual increase in the reliability and quantity of rations issued. By April, the army was receiving regular, if not generous, provisions. By May, the situation had stabilized to the point where soldiers could maintain their strength. The improvement came too late for the thousands who had already died, but it saved the army from complete collapse and allowed the training that Steuben implemented to take hold in soldiers who had sufficient food to sustain the physical demands of drill. The psychological transformation of the Continental Army during the Valley Forge winter remains difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. The soldiers who survived had enjoyed something that, by rights, should have broken them. They had starved while their government failed them, had frozen while politicians debated, had buried their comrades in numbers that would have justified mutiny or mass desertion. Yet they had remained, and in remaining they had discovered something about themselves and about their cause. This was not the romantic patriotism of 1776, the enthusiasm that had motivated enlistment when independence seemed a glorious adventure. This was something harder and more durable, a commitment forged not in the excitement of decoration, but in the shared suffering of survival. A bond between soldiers who had endured hell together and who now possessed both the skills and the determination to fight effectively. The news that arrived in May 1778 that France had formally allied with the United States, recognizing American independence and committing French military and naval power to the war, electrified the camp. The alliance transformed the strategic situation overnight. What had been a colonial rebellion that Britain could suppress at its leisure became a global conflict that threatened British interests across the Atlantic and in the Caribbean. The French alliance validated the sacrifices of Valley Forge, suggesting that those who had died had not perished in a futile cause but as martyrs in a struggle that would ultimately succeed. Washington ordered a celebration, and on May 6 the army formed up for a grand review, demonstrating the drill and coordination that Steuben had taught them, firing organized volleys in salute, marching in formation across the parade ground. It was a symbolic moment. The army that had entered Valley Forge as a defeated, starving mob emerged as a disciplined military force capable of meeting British regulars on equal terms. When the British evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778, redeploying to New York in response to the French threat to their position in Pennsylvania, the Continental Army pursued. And at Monmouth Court House in New Jersey, they fought the British to a standstill in a pitched battle that saw American troops withstand British assault and counterattack effectively. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but strategically it demonstrated that the Continental Army had become a professional force. The difference between the army that fled Germantown in October 1777 and the army that held its ground at Monmouth in June 1778 was the difference that Valley Forge had created. Yet the mythology that would grow round Valley Forge in subsequent American history, the notion that it was a crucible that purified the revolutionary cause through suffering, that Washington and his men endured hardship with stoic nobility, that the winter of 1777 to 78 was when America proved it deserved independence, obscures the darker truths of what actually occurred. Valley Forge was not a test of national virtue, but a failure of national governance. The suffering was not necessary or inevitable, but the result of congressional incompetence, inadequate logistics, and a political system that could not perform the basic functions required to sustain an army. Soldiers died not because the enemy was too strong, but because their own government could not feed or clothe them. The survival of the Continental Army owed less to Washington's leadership or American determination than to British strategic miscalculation, Howe's failure to attack Valley Forge when the Americans were defenseless was a gift that the British would regret. The soldiers who died at Valley Forge deserved better than the deaths they received. They deserved a government capable of providing for armies it sent to war. They deserved officers who could requisition basic supplies. They deserved not to freeze and starve while politicians debated and supplies rotted in warehouses because no one had organized transportation. Their suffering was not ennobling, but tragic, a waste of lives that could have been prevented by basic administrative competence. The fact that the Continental Army survived Valley Forge and emerged stronger is testament not to the virtues of suffering, but to the remarkable resilience of soldiers who endured what should have killed them and who refused to abandon a cause even when that cause seemed to have abandoned them. Washington himself, in the years after the war, rarely spoke of Valley Forge except to acknowledge the soldiers' suffering and his own sense of failure at having been unable to prevent it. The winter of 1777 to 78 haunted him, represented a command crisis where he had been powerless to protect his men from an enemy more insidious than British regulars. The letters he wrote during that winter, preserved in his papers, convey a sense of desperation that the mythological Washington, the marble figure of later hagiography, never displayed. He begged Congress for supplies, warned that the army would dissolve without food, described soldiers deserting because their families were starving, admitted that he lacked solutions to problems that exceeded his capacity to solve. These letters reveal a commander at the limits of his ability, sustained not by confidence in victory, but by sheer refusal to quit even when quitting would have been the rational choice. The frozen hell of Valley Forge ended when spring arrived and the British evacuated Philadelphia, but its legacy shaped the remainder of the war and the nation that would emerge from that war. The recognition that the Continental Congress was incapable of effectively governing during wartime would lead directly to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and the creation of a stronger federal government with actual powers of taxation and administration. The suffering of the Continental Army would motivate provisions in the Constitution ensuring that the federal government could raise and support armies. The soldiers who survived Valley Forge would form a fraternity whose shared experience gave them disproportionate influence in the early republic. They had earned credibility through suffering that no civilian could match. But for those who died in the frozen huts, who were buried in unmarked graves, whose names were lost to history or survive only as entries in casualty lists, Valley Forge meant simply death. They did not live to see victory at Yorktown or the British recognition of American independence or the creation of the Constitution. They died in misery, accomplishing nothing by their deaths except to reduce by one the number of soldiers in Washington's army. Their suffering deserves to be remembered not as noble sacrifice, but as preventable tragedy, as an indictment of the system that sent them to war without the means to sustain them, as a reminder that courage and determination cannot compensate for a failed governance, and that soldiers, no matter how brave, cannot survive on patriotism alone when they are starving and freezing and dying of diseases that adequate supplies and shelter would have prevented. The Continental Army should have died at Valley Forge. By every reasonable calculation, by the laws of logistics and nutrition, by the historical precedents of what happened to armies that endured such conditions, by the evidence of mass death and desertion, the force that entered winter quarters in December 1777 should not have existed as a functional military organization by spring 1778. That it survived, that it emerged stronger, remains one of history's improbabilities, a victory snatched not from the jaws of military defeat, but from the abyss of administrative collapse and governmental failure. The soldiers who endured Valley Forge accomplished something remarkable not because they were superhuman, but because they refused to accept the death that circumstances had prepared for them. Because they outlasted winter and disease and starvation through nothing more than stubborn refusal to die. It was not a glorious victory, but a grim survival, and perhaps that makes it more impressive. There is no glory in starving, no romance in dysentery, no heroism in freezing to death in a hut. There is only the cold arithmetic of endurance. You wake up, you survive another day, you bury the dead, and you continue until either you die or circumstances change. At Valley Forge, enough soldiers continued long enough for circumstances to change, and that bare fact of survival, inglorious and unheroic as it was, saved the American Revolution and allowed a nation to be born from the frozen hell where it should have died.